enemies. And the enemies would be his own countrymen, the Jewish people, and actually the religious leaders of the day, the ones that should be standing up for his right and his cause. But we already saw earlier in this chapter, verse 1, the Passover and the unleavened bread was 2 days off, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize him by stealth and how to kill him. They've already passed the judgment on him, haven't they? I mean, there's no need for a trial. They're just looking for an opportunity. By stealth shows the nature of this execution. It's not a legal one, is it? It's criminal, through and through. That they don't know how to deal with Jesus. They're afraid of the power that he's taking away from them, and so they're going to maliciously kill him, and they're going to do it under the pretense of some type of trial. And so that's what we're going to look at as we look in this last two sections, Jesus before his accusers, and of course then chapter 14 ends with Peter's denials of Jesus. So a lot of information here. Let's read some of it, and then we'll try to break it down and talk about it. So verse 53, and they led Jesus away. See, he's been arrested in the garden. The disciples fled. We were left with this young man who escapes naked. He was the last person we mentioned in verse 51 and 52. So they lead Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. And Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priest and the whole council kept saying trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. And they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, well, we heard him say, I'll destroy this temple with my hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. Verse 60, and the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Now finally Jesus speaks. And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of this? You have heard the blasphemy. And does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. All right, so we're familiar with this, and so we could spend a lot of detail just explaining what was going on, but we want to see really more of the spirit of what was behind all this. And of course, we know this was all according to God's plan, wasn't it? And so the fact that Jesus is on trial really makes no difference if it was legal or not, because God planned it this way. But we know that when we look at this group of people, the high priests, the chief priests, the scribes, they constitute what we call the Sanhedrin Council, all right? And so it is the highest council or court of that day that was allowed under the Roman occupation. It consisted of the high priest who presided over it, and there were also 70 people with him, and it was made up of the priests, and were mainly Sadducees, and they were the more liberal group of the two between that and the Pharisees. The scribes, which were the experts or the lawyers in the old law, and then the elders made up of largely Pharisees. And so here we have this group of 70, the high priest in the middle. The accused would stand before him, and this is where they'd conduct a trial. Who was perhaps a prominent member of this later after Christ? Well, Nicodemus, but I'm thinking Paul. All right. Okay, so this is like going in front of our high Supreme Court, but probably a lot more intimidating. Okay, and so this is where he's standing before them. And when we learn from the writings of that day about how court procedures were supposed to go on, we find a lot of irregularities or illegal aspects of court. So we'll spend a lot of time on them, but I just want to point them out to you. There was no legal right to have this court at night, okay? It was not supposed to be held before the Sabbath the next day. And you do not have a court to find charges against a person. What happens in Western law in court? Why would you go to court? You're already charged because there's evidence for you to bind you over to the courts, and then they hold a trial. Right, first a grand jury, then the actual court, depending on the type of charge it is. So this is totally opposite. They're going to have court, and then they're going to try to come up with the charge. Now you say, well, why would they do that? Again, it doesn't matter, because they've already predetermined his guilt, that they're going to kill him. So anything that works will fit, satisfy them. They don't care if they're doing things right or wrong. That's perhaps why they're doing it at night in the first place, so it could be done in secrecy, all right? And so we can stand, appalled, like, oh, it's the injustice. And it was, but it's all part of God's plan, right? That's what we have to understand. Jesus is really not on trial. He is just going through these procedures to get to the cross because he knows it's God's will. He's already prayed that this cup would pass, but he's already willing to submit. And we already read in John where he said, no one takes my life, but I lay it down by my own initiative. Yes, Linda.
Are they not stoning him because of not wanting to do things in public or because of the Romans?
Both, because we've said earlier that the people held him to be a prophet, so they don't want to do this public. But so they got to get him charged with something that is serious enough that the people get behind, and then the Romans have to actually execute him because they don't have the legal authority to put someone to death. They have being occupied by the Roman government. So he's not given an attorney. He was supposed to be allowed someone to prepare 2 days ahead of time, his defense. That's where Western law comes from as well. Very similar. The witnesses, when I call them so-called witnesses, none came forward with the charge that brought about this trial, but they looked for him after the trial to see how reversed it was. Yes. Well, and sometimes, I don't want to say, I don't have a perfect answer, but this way I understand it. Sometimes spontaneously things happen, and the Romans just, okay, that's those Jews taking care of their own religious matters. Who was the person that they brought before, and they said, this is your, I'm drawing a blank now. These religious matters he didn't want anything to do with? Huh? Boy, that's a blank. It's right. You know what I'm talking about? And he dismissed them? Huh? That was. Oh, yeah, okay. Right. Pilate, yeah, didn't have anything to do with it. Thank you. Man, that's a weird blank, okay?
There was times Jesus, they come to stone him too, and he would ask them, for which offense are you stoning him?
That's right.
So
yeah.
It was spontaneous.
Yes, and sometimes he slipped away. So they could do it, and I think like Rome would just, that's those guys in the religious matters. Does that somewhat answer?
But Paul did. I mean, he was a part of it, and he also...
Got legal authority to. He was carrying papers to do it when he went to Damascus, so we could assume he did that all the time, even in Jerusalem. Now, did those have to come from Rome as well? Well, when you watch the movies, they say they did, but but that's the movies, yes.
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 So God had some
Yeah.
I'm not worrying about the thing.
Yeah, leave him alone. All right. Well, no two of them agreed. If we find in the old law that you have to have witnesses collaborating this charge, and if they were lying falsely, then they were supposed to be dismissed immediately and actually prosecuted, because it's, well, as we're going to see, God, he hates a lot of things, and one thing that he hates is false witnesses. But notice in Isaiah 53, again, I'm just trying to emphasize this is all God's plan, and it's already been prophesied that by oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation who considered, he was cut off out of the land of the living. Isaiah 53 is this beautiful prophecy of the suffering servant of Jesus Christ. It was all planned, okay? So the false witnesses that come forward, they're trying, they kept trying, and that just shows this one after another. And can you imagine the frustration of the religious leaders? Oh, can't we get anyone to agree on a lie? I mean, testimony, okay? So they kept trying, and they're trying to find something to put him to death, and they couldn't. But he says their testimony was not consistent. And that just, it's kind of interesting to me, because why do they care if it's consistent? But it shows that there's some appearance, for appearance sake, they're trying to give of a legal trial here. They're trying to have some resemblance of this as being a fair trial. But in the big picture, why do they care if it's consistent? Yeah, because it's all a sham anyway. But Proverbs says this, 6 things which the Lord hates, the 7th is abomination. And in there is a false witness. What is the 9th commandment? Thou shalt not bear false witness. Or we say it's thou shalt not lie. Lying there is talking about lying in court. Because it's one of the most grievous things that when you're brought before a court, and because you want something on this person, maybe you want to take his property, or you just want to see him put in jail because you're mad at, you lie, and an innocent person suffers. Is there any worse tragedy than that? Just out of your lips, that you can have someone suffer and when they're innocent. Now, in this case, it takes 2 people, right? Supposedly, to do that. But God hates that. That's why it's one of the 10 commandments. It's iconic about how to walk before God. You must speak the truth, all right, at all times. So that is what we see going on. So some stood up and began to give false testimony against Sam. And here it gets now more specific, at least as recorded by Mark. Well, we heard him say, I'll destroy the temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made up without hands. Okay, is this accusation true or false? Huh? True? True? False. All right, we got the Pharisees over here, the Sadducees here, or vice versa, I don't know. All right, you're by Sanhedrin. You're both right, because notice what it says. Jesus said in John chapter 2, destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. But it says in the next verse, he's referring to his body. Did they understand that? All right. But he's speaking about his death and his burial and his resurrection. Okay, this temple being the body or the temple that holds his spirit. Yes.
In front of the Sanhedrin court, Nicodemus in John 7, verse 51 says, does their law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? Mm-hmm. And of course they answered and said to him, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee.
Right.
So, you know, him coming in defense shows that normally they would have the proper judgments, the evidence before they would condemn anyone, but in this case they did not.
Well, they're looking for it. You're right. Yeah, trying to manufacture it. Jesus also said in Mark 13, he taught the whole chapter. Remember, it was about the destruction of the temple. All right, but they misunderstood all this language, because when he's actually on the cross, these people that are walking by are just mocking him by saying, ha, You're the one who's going to destroy the temple and rebuild in 3 days. Yeah, right. Just save yourself first. That'd be a good feat, much less trying to destroy the temple. So they misunderstood what he said, because did he ever say he was going to destroy it? Well, yes, he did. Because Mark 13, he predicted the destruction of the temple, and he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. So who did he claim would be the power behind the destruction of the Jerusalem? Well, through the Romans, but himself. But did they understand any of that? No. So they're taking this statement to mean the literal temple. So in one sense, it's right, but the other sense, it's totally wrong. Does that make sense? All right, so we have 3 senses. Since it's right, since it's wrong, but they're all together, they make sense. But even in this, they're not consistent. In other words, they don't know what to lie about. They don't know what to make of him. And really, doesn't that explain the life of Christ on that day? Even his disciples didn't get it, did they? And we have to understand it's because it was supposed to be a mystery. They weren't supposed to understand. And again, I remind you of that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This mystery, if the rulers of that day had understood it, what does it say? They would not have crucified the Christ. If they would have realized, oh, this is all part of God's plan, we're not nothing to do with it. But they didn't get it, so that's why they're involved in this thing. Yes?
Interesting to me is that the way this trial happened, if it had not been for Roman involvement, those of us who are not Jewish heritage could just say, well, we're not guilty. But the Gentiles were involved as well. Physically, with that trial then, we're all guilty because our sin.
Okay.
But the staging of it also physically involved the Gentile government.
Exactly. And so since you brought that up, there has been a debate, and who knows where it comes from, probably largely from the Jewish people. They hate being accused of being the murderers of Christ. So there's been this saying, no, the Jews never killed him, the Romans did. Now, is that true? Yes, but the real truth of the matter is, who demanded the Romans kill him? The Jews. But does that make the Romans innocent? Because Pilate tried to wash his hands. Well, that was kind of hypocritical because he had the power to release him, didn't he? But he beckoned to the Jews. So who's guilty? Both parties. But Peter in his first sermon, Acts chapter 2, this Jesus of Nazareth, who God approved of you, with signs, miracles, and wonders in your midst, just as you know, you, what does he say? Killed him. You murdered him by the hands of godless men. You killed him by the hands of godless men, the Romans. But he lays the charge for his murder at the feet of the Jews. So that's the end of that story. Yes?
Well, it was prophesied that that was the last of the blood that need to be shed. The judgment for the shedding of all the bloods of the prophets and everything
Right.
for generations would come down
Right.
in that group, because the final straw was Christ, as even the parable of the landowner.
Exactly. Yeah, you done? Yeah, because this is the climax of everything that God has planned, and he has to be the sacrifice there. So I don't want us to miss some thoughts here. Just as we're talking about the temple, it's an interesting theme that just keeps coming up, because when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the first thing he did was cleanse the temple. That was in Mark 11, if you remember that. He talks about himself being the rejected cornerstone. Who rejected him? Who were the Jews, or the religious people, the leaders. But he now becomes the cornerstone of what? What's the cornerstone of? The church, yes. The new temple. Ephesians chapter 2. We find in 1 Peter 2 and 1 Corinthians 3 that the church, yes, built on Jesus Christ, the cornerstone, we are being built up into a new and living temple. So here he talks about how this physical one's going to be destroyed, But I'm going to be the cornerstone that you reject into God's new spiritual temple, as he's rejected this one since he's left it a long time because you rejected him. And I will abide with my people forever. And so that's what he's talking about. And in this temple, who's going to be the final sacrifice to end all other sacrifices? Jesus. Because there have been daily sacrifices before the temple, haven't there? Daily, millions of animals perhaps. And then Jesus said, I'm going to be the final sacrifice that puts an end to all this. And all that come to me, can have a relationship with the Father. I want you to see this theme that's going on. And they don't grasp it, and I hope that we don't miss it either. Yes?
And Jack, in the Matthew account, the Jews basically asked the blood of that innocent person to be
Yes.
and their children. The Pilate tells them, says, he washes his hands, says, I'm innocent of this just person. And the people respond, and I'm quoting from Matthew 27, his blood be on us and all of our children.
Exactly, and that's why I said the blood of all the guilt of all the murder of the prophets is going to fall upon this generation because they killed the last prophet, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. It's interesting, even at his death, what happens in the temple? This veil that was so thick, it'd be humanly impossible to rip. It's ripped from the top down. From the holy place to the most holy. Who can only go in the most holy? High priest once a year, because that's where God dwelt. Showing now that Jesus has entered through the veil, and now we have access to the Father, all of us, which is beautiful, because Jesus is our high priest, and through him we can go right to the Father. We don't need some man on this earth like the Jews did. A whole new and living temple. All this is going on, and it is coming about in this process. And so that's why it's so important that Jesus had to die on the cross, to offer a sacrifice. He's in charge. Don't think the Jews are in charge for a second. He's totally in charge of what's going on. All right, does that all make sense? A lot here. We could spend a lot. So Jesus and you and I, we are really the final temple of God. We are his permanent dwelling, the one that he planned from the very beginning, where he says, you shall be my people and I shall be your God. Isn't that a beautiful thought? We are his children. He'll come and dwell with us. Yes?
The Jews did not want change. They wanted to keep things the way they were.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So finally, the high priest, as we read, I don't know if he's frustrated, but he just takes charge. Yeah. So, okay. And he's going to address Jesus directly. Now, again, if it were you and I in front of this scene with all these 70 men, and now the high priest is going to speak to you, and he has potentially life and death, your life or death in his hand, would that be quite intimidating? Yeah, I would think so. I mean, we get nervous just when a cop pulls us over, and if we have to go in front of a traffic court, we're just shaking our knees, and that's just a traffic court. Can you imagine this? Yes.
Real quickly, while listening to you, I've played in my mind, were the Sanhedrin evil, or were they trying to do what their position was to do? And I thought for a minute that maybe they were just ill-informed, confused, didn't understand the scripture. But when you think about listening to testimony that didn't make full sense and going ahead, I guess you have to leave the idea that they were sort of innocent because they didn't understand.
Yeah.
You have to really say, no, they knew what they were doing and they did it with intent.
Yes. Certainly they didn't understand the bigger picture, but they're still evil in a way they're carrying out their desires. It's malicious. Everything about it is. And that's why Jesus calls them hypocrites, So, no, that's a good observation as well. So he comes up and he questions Jesus, says, aren't you going to answer these charges? Now, what's wrong with that? Him just asking Jesus that question. Come on, you attorneys, you people that watch Perry Mason.
You're supposed to have a lawyer, you're supposed to have had 2 days to prepare, and there really haven't been any charges made.
No charges. But there's something wrong with this question, though. It's leading, but what would we... What would we plead? The fifth. What does that give you the right? To not incriminate yourself. That was one of their laws too. You can't get a witness to testify against himself that incriminate himself. Right? He's saying, aren't you going to answer? And what does Jesus do? He kept silent. Did he know the answer? Well, of course. Could he have answered? Yes. Now again, hopefully you're reminded of Isaiah 53. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before his shearers, he did not open his mouth. Boy, 700 years written before this event, how did Isaiah know exactly what was going to happen in that courtroom? It was God's plan. And so, again, you know who's in charge, and it helps us make sense of all of this, all right? So he did not answer a thing. But now the high priest again repeats it, and he gets really, really specific. And maybe this is what was haunting them all along, because they heard the claims of Jesus to be the Christ. And so now he just comes to that. He just says, are you the Christ? Now that to them means a whole lot more than it does to most people today. The Christ is the Messiah, the anointed one. He's God's chosen one. And we're going to look at Psalms 110, who's going to sit on his right hand. And they thought maybe that just meant the right hand of David only on his throne. But he's going to restore Israel to its former glory. He is going to subdue the Romans, and they're going to have their own dominion against their land once again. They're going to be free and free forever. And the idea of the Son of the Blessed One sounds like they would understand him to be divine, but could you speak of someone as being the Son of God without being his son? Literally. Well, they would. Like, you're one that follows the Lord, you're a son of God, all right? And because they didn't expect the Christ to actually be divine, much less die on a cross, okay? So this question is laden with lots of backstory and meaning to them. And of course, Jesus, does he know the answer to this? Yes, he knows who he is. And what's interesting, he finally comes back and makes an answer. And he says, I am. Now, what we've already referred to earlier, God's covenant name is literally Jehovah. It's how it's translated in the American Standard. Comes from this Hebrew word Yahweh, which roughly translates the existent one, or the I am. Remember in Exodus 3 when Moses asked, who shall I say sent me? What did God say? I am that I am. So that's one interesting thing right there. I am. But what is he saying I am to? He's self-identifying with the Father when he says I am, but he's also saying, yeah, I am the Christ. Then he says, furthermore, let's just tell you a little more. Now Jesus is really incriminating himself by saying this. This is blasphemous in itself, and I'll explain that in a second. But first of all, you're going to see the Son of Man coming. And then you're going to see, of course, he's going to come on the clouds. And then you're going to see this idea of the right hand of power. Now, we're going to look at these two texts, but, well, let's just read them right now. Look with me in, first of all, Daniel chapter 7. This is understood to be messianic even by their day, whether they understood what it meant after at all. Daniel 7 is a picture of the throne of God. That's verse 9. The Ancient of Days, that's Jehovah himself sitting on his throne in heaven. There's zillions of these angels in verse 10 around him. Okay. But verse 13 is where I want you to see for our benefit that Jesus is quoting here. Now, in Acts chapter 1 and verse 9, and also the end of the Gospels, when Jesus leaves the earth, what do we see him doing? Ascending or leaving into the clouds. From our point of view, if we were there, he's going up. Right? You got that? Now, do you see where he goes? No, he just goes up in the clouds, and you don't see him anything beyond that. Acts chapter 7 is from heaven's point of view, and Jesus is not going up. He's coming from the earth to heaven. See the difference? So the men are on the earth watching him leave. Now in heaven, you're seeing the Son of Man coming up to heaven. He's already emptied himself, become a baby, lived his life on the earth, a sacrifice for sins. Now he's coming up to receive what? King of kings, Lord of lords. All authority is going to be given to him, and he's going to sit on the throne of God. So we know that, looking back, they didn't have that understanding. Verse 13, I kept looking the night visions, and behold, with the clouds, Jesus went up in the clouds. Now he's coming up to heaven in the clouds. One like a son of man was coming. He came up to the Ancient of Days, that's Jehovah the Father, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. What did Jesus say when he came and preached on this earth? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So now after he's died and become the sacrifice, he's coronated as king. And Jesus is quoting this, saying, you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds because that's who I am. That's a direct reference to Daniel 7. But now look at Psalms 110. Just a single verse in verse 1. This Psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord. This is quoted by Jesus himself. Peter himself, when he's talking about you killed him in the first sermon. Remember, you killed him, but God raised him. Now where is he now? God exalted him. He quotes this verse, because the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thy enemies a footstool for thy feet. And so Jesus is going to be allowed to sit on the throne of God next to him, and there's going to be judgment of his enemies. So this is inflammatory statement. First of all, it says, I'm God. Second of all, I'm going to sit with God and rule over you. You think you're ruling over me. Thirdly, I'm coming in judgment over you, and you will all be punished. Now, wait a second. Who are you standing before? The highest court of the day. You should be on your knees trembling, begging for mercy. Is that the posture of Jesus at all? No, he says, you've got it all backwards. I'm not on trial. You're on trial here. Is that not true? Do they see that? Now, when they hear that, they become furious. It says they rent their clothes. That was a graphic description of a protest. Sometimes lamenting and grief and sorrow over a death of one, but sometimes of outrage. And that's what they do. It says that they tore his clothes, the high priest. We don't need to hear anymore. You've heard the blasphemy. Now, the word blasphemy is translated revile when it's about person to person. And it literally means, well, not literally, it means to speak evil against someone. So if Bruce would say something bad about me, we could say he's reviling me. We don't use that word, but it's really the word blasphemo. He's blaspheming. But when you speak about God something wrong, the Bible translated as blasphemy. So it's the same Greek word, but when it's translated for man to man, it's revile. When it's to God, it's always blasphemy. But the word itself means to speak slowly or to not get it correct. In other words, if you're to say something about God that's not true, you're lying about him. and you're taking the position of God yourself, and you're holding him in judgment. So you say, well, God's just not being fair. Ooh, what have you just done? Have you spoken evil of God? And what's even worse than just what you said, it's the position you put yourself in. You put yourself in a position higher than God that you know more than he does. You have a better perspective, a bigger picture, and you look at what God has just done in your life or in someone else and said, God, you have not been fair. Do you see the gravity of how serious that is? And that's blasphemy. It's to get things turned around. It's to get them backwards. So that you're the judge and the jury, and you're condemning him when he's the one that is the one that's judging you. Does that happen today all the time? I can't believe it, a God that allows people to suffer. Oh, what did they just do? They just judged God. And how many times do we blame God, or people you hear blaming God? What are you doing when you do that? We're just judging God, condemning him. And that's our society. They want to write off God entirely because they got things all backwards. They think they're the supreme ones that have the bigger picture. And it's like, oh, you just don't get it. Do they get it? No. Now, they have an excuse only as much as it's a mystery. Yes?
To me, the hypocrisy is amazing here because when you look at the question the high priest asked him, it speaks volumes. They had seen him raise people from the dead.
Well, exactly.
He healed people. They had seen him give sight to the blind and so forth and so on. You know, they knew there was something about this man that was different.
Exactly. See, they're ignoring all the evidences that he gives to substantiate this. And so when it comes to this charge, there's two possibilities. Either it's false, right? This charge of blasphemy, that's what I'm talking about. Or it's going to be true, right? Now, from human perspective, would it true be a appropriate response to what Jesus just said from a human perspective? Because Jesus looks like what? A man taking the place of God. It's like Steve doing it. Now, whether you understood the miracles or not, because some of the prophets did miracles as well. If Steve said, I am Jehovah, let's kill him. That's blasphemy at the highest. From that point of view, it makes sense that they would make it. Yes? Right. Correct. Right. Right. Yeah. No, and there's a lot of merit, and that's why we started there, because, but even in saying it, he's answering their question. I am. And also, I am. So it's like a double powerful, and so you can understand how they might think it's true. You've just blasphemed by uttering his name and claiming to be him and saying you are the Christ and all those things. But we know it's false. Jesus knows that, doesn't he? He knows it's false, this claim of blasphemy, right? Huh? Because what he's saying is, I am. It's true. So the true is the charge of blasphemy. It's not true. But to them, you can understand why they might think it is. Because it's such an amazing statement. And I don't want the power of this statement to be lost on you. Because he's just incriminated himself. He just sealed the deal for his death just by this statement right here. This is his great confession. Now, we talk about the great confession of Peter. Remember when Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Here's really the great confession. It's Jesus acknowledging who he was. He just said, I am, and that's what put him to death. They had no testimony. They had no witnesses. They weren't going to get the job done until Jesus said what? 2 words, I am. That's what got him killed. Do you see that? All right, yes.
A little bit in connection with what Nate said, and that's where our society has everything backwards again. How many times do we hear or bombarded each day using God's name
Oh, yeah.
or as an exclamation as something just
Yes.
common and off the street?
Yeah, it's all around us. And that's one way we blaspheme God, by using his name in vain. But the greater blasphemy is when we start questioning and judging him by our questions. Because a question is a judgment.
It goes together.
Yes.
When you do one, the others follow.
They do, right? So no other need a testimony. You've heard the blasphemy. And so we see that what happens where we went through that. We read all those. So now they begin to spit on him, to blindfold him, beat him. So yeah, if you're really the Christ, tell us who just hit you. Now it's funny because the charge is false. Jesus is the Christ. Does he know who just hit him? What kind of self-will and power does it take when someone's hitting you and then you're being challenged to reveal who it is, and you know who it is, but you're silent? Again, he knows this because it's about God's will and not his. It takes so much self-control. Yes?
Question, Jack. Would we have to assume, the verse says they all condemn him, would we have to assume that Nicodemus is part of that?
Well, when all is it a majority? I don't know. Maybe so.
That's a thought question.
Well, I would say no, that Nicodemus wasn't part of that, because he defended Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin, number one. Number two, at his death, he brought that 100 pounds of spices.
Yeah.
That was put within the closet. They buried Jesus, showing that who would do that and who would defend Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin court. And
Yeah.
being a teacher of the Jews, considered that's what Jesus
But
called him. Why would you do that?
those are good questions, and it's good. But Peter, we're going to see in just a second, is going to deny him. Why would he deny him? So in the moment, anything could have happened. But obviously what Dave is saying, afterwards he showed some type of homage to Jesus, and so we have to grant him that. Did he feel guilty? If he did condemn him as well, we don't know.
Well, his response to Jesus in John 3, again, when he went to him, he says, we know that you are a teacher come from God.
Sure.
No one can do these signs that you do unless God is with them. And there were many in that, I believe, in that Sanhedrin court that believed it too.
Well, it said in John 12, many of the rulers believed, but they weren't willing to confess them.
Yeah, because it'd be awesome.
And so that could have been Nicodemus, that he condemned them out of his lack of spine. But we don't know, is what I'm saying. Because Peter, who confessed that he was the Christ, denied him. So it's easy for me to see one of the Sanhedrin denying him.
And the very name for Nicodemus means innocent of blood.
Well, yeah, I know, but we don't know. It doesn't say. You make a great case, but the bottom line is we don't know. I can't answer the question, but it's fair to ask. I want to finish this because I know I had some hands. We know about Peter's denials. First of all, he's in the courtyard, and he's warming himself, and there's soldiers around him. We already read that. Officers. And this servant girl accuses him, saying, you're one of his disciples. That's the charge. All right? He denies it. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then it happens again. They wanted to buy, you're one of them. And he what? Denies it. And so it happened the third time, and he curses and swears. I don't know what you're talking about. That's when the cock crows. Peter, remember how Jesus said, that's going to happen, and he begins to weep. I want you to see there's two trials going on. Jesus has just gone through a trial. Peter's going through a trial, and this is our trial. First of all, he's being questioned, isn't he, just like Jesus? Are you the Christ? Are you one of his disciples? And if Nicodemus was, he didn't stand up and defend him. He denied him just like Peter. But he's on trial. And Peter is being charged with something that could cause him trouble, isn't it? Jesus is being charged with blasphemy, and his confession, I am, he told the truth, got him killed. Peter has the opportunity to tell the truth, and he might die for it. So what does he do? He doesn't tell the truth. He lies. He blasphemes. He gets it upside down. And then Jesus is innocent. He dies. Peter's guilty, and he gets off, doesn't he? And then we find Jesus is beaten by the guards. Peter, we find him warming himself with the guards. So I guess we're going to leave this. Who's really on trial? All of us. When we're questioned, are you really a disciple of Christ? Are you willing to speak the truth and bear the consequences in this world? Do we question Jesus like the Sanhedrin and just said, you can't say, this blasphemous? Do we get things turned around? And so there's a lot going on here than just this, simple denials of Jesus. It's really an opportunity for us to reflect on ourselves. All right, thank you. That's the end of chapter 14.